So every event like this, we find lots of cool stuff. But let's begin and talk about these wonderful POSIX extensions. And this year, we actually have
implementation.
Code. So we've talked about this for so many years. So we had CIFS extensions, as you know, for POSIX. And as you know, they have a great history.
You should start it with the who we are, what we are.
Oh, well.
If we're officially starting.
Yeah, who are you? Yeah, I don't know.
If we're officially starting, we need
So
to.
Steve.
That's right.
So the who are we?
Well, the legal statement thing.
Yeah, the legal statement.
I have to say this is not a Google talk, blah, blah,
Yeah,
blah.
this is not a Google Talk, it's not a Microsoft Talk. It's not a requirement that Tom Talpy document anything.
Oh, cool.
So,
Running for the exits.
trying to escape. So, I've been working for Microsoft Azure since early in this year, and you've worked for Google forever.
11 years now.
So, what is kind of cool, though, is that there's a history about these extensions. Remember SCO?
Yes.
Remember HP? So, we have this history dating from the late 90s for Unix extensions. And in SNIA, we produced a technical reference of sorts, a document that documented these extensions, and they were revved once by Jeremy and I and others. And that document was very useful until WannaCry and everybody else forced us to revisit this problem and open the can of worms. So what are we going to talk about today? What is POSIX? Maybe, we're not going to demo per se, but I have demo slides, so we don't have to fail on that. And we're going to talk about what works and also the brief alternatives, because we need to talk about things like how Apple does this. And also a little more details, because we actually have implementation and we've actually changed a few minor things this week. But I also want to remind you, this isn't just about the POSIX extensions, it's also about the Windows things that we didn't know about that let us do POSIX extensions without having to extend the protocol. So some of this is about using features that are already there, and some of this is about the very small set of new features we're adding. Okay, so continuing on. POSIX, Linux is not POSIX. The Mac has the same problem. You have a POSIX API, it has a certain number of calls. The real apps use more stuff. POSIX is small. To run on a Mac or to run on Linux, it's bigger. These syscalls, to give you a scale, we have, now this is 3 months ago, so it might have added one or two. 293 syscalls. How many of them are POSIX? About a third. There's a lot of stuff. When we talk about POSIX, sometimes we're kind of making a slight generalization here that we're talking about other syscalls as well. Making it work well on Linux and other Unix-like operating systems. What were the motivation? Apps working. Case sensitivity is required. We have these POSIX-like behaviors, whether they're on-prem or in the cloud. I think I showed you before my previous talk that the backup copy of my presentation I've got stored in Azure. You know, if disk dies, I want to be able to mount from Jeremy's laptop, recover just run the presentation off the Azure share, and we've done that in the past, of course. So making sure that we have backup copies, that everything works, the apps, the boring apps, like this is, you know, LibreOffice, right? Making sure LibreOffice and all its quirks, PowerPoint works. And common situations where they have Linux, Mac, and Windows together, making sure that works, and also making sure that no one wants to run CIFS because CIFS worked for their apps because of POSIX. Now it's broken on SMB3, so they're exposing all their data to these attacks. They're making insecure decisions because we had POSIX extensions but not SMB3. We don't want people doing that. So what could you try together? Today, what could you try today? He has a tree that is on Samba.org.
Yeah.
The current Linux kernel has enough to be able to send the stuff out. It doesn't look at the mode that's coming back and all that, but it does have enough to do a lot of really cool things. But it's experimental, so you must specify in current Linux kernel the mount option that says POSIX, and you must mount with SMB311.
So the current server changes are actually they're around 4,000 to 6,000 lines of code, depending on how you do the diffs. So it's actually remarkably small, being as the fact that Samba is sort of 1 million lines of code.
More than 1 million.
Yeah. But the thing, and the other thing is that this isn't a bit rotting tree. That's continually getting out of date. Every month or so, I rebase it on top of current master. So if you want to try it out, you know, with the new features, Well,
Well, you did rebase it yesterday. Come on.
I rebased it today, actually.
Okay. That's not bad.
Not every morning because, yes, I'm not working on it every day. So it's a reasonably small set of changes. As of Steve's talk an hour ago, it's now theoretically feature complete in terms of implementing all of the things that Steve's client needs to have full POSIX semantics. It's completely untested, so now the work starts of actually writing tests on it.
Now, to be fair, completely untested means we've tested 30% of the features.
Yeah, but what I mean is there's no regression tests. I haven't checked that I haven't broken the SMB1 POSIX extensions, so there's a lot more work to do. But what I'm saying is that the tree that's listed there, you can download today, you can check it out. The very cool thing about this right now is that another vendor down in the Plugfest has already started to implement, which I find very, very compelling. The fact that we kind of screwed it up that badly if someone else was able to implement some features on it.
And another way to think about this is the 4,000-ish lines of code he's talking about. On the client side, it's actually significantly smaller than that. So, okay. So is that working better?
Yeah,
Okay.
I just want to make sure we're done.
Okay. So I wanted to make sure. Oops.
That's me.
Just move it up, move the microphone.
Turn this off. It's really
Okay. So at least we can say who it was.
I don't know. Did they tell you could say?
Yeah. I mean, they've been no commitment. It was Chuck Serra, right? Anyway, it's not a big deal. Okay, so hopefully that's going to sound better now. So let's think about this at a very high level. We've got 1,000-ish lines of code on the client, maybe 2,000. We've got 4,000 on the server for something that gets us near perfect compatibility for things that matter to real users. Now, can you do a lot of this without the extensions? Absolutely. And when we talk about extensions, in my case, over half the changes really had nothing to do with the POSIX extensions. They're things, Windows features that we're turning on now that we're realizing were available, that both ends are now implementing. And the intent is to make this implementable across any operating system by keeping them quite small. Okay, so today you can make a directory, you can create a file, the mode bits will be correct on the server. Today you can do rename and unlink, and the behavior is as you expect with POSIX. Today, you can create an uppercase and a lowercase version of a file. It'll work as expected. Those parts work. What doesn't work on the client side is a few things like the server created symlinks. That's almost done, but that was what we were testing like during Volker's talk. And I mean, symlinks work, but not the ones that we create on the server. So if you're looking at a symlink that was created by NFS on the server and we're trying to read it back, that's almost ready. And then the other piece is parsing in the response buffer the mode bit and owner that came back from the server. And part of the reason that I delayed putting that in the current code was so we had a little bit more freedom at this event to change our mind. Because I didn't want to put something in the kernel that was going to go change tomorrow. So I was trying to be doing this with the lowest risk while maximizing the testability. But if you wanted to do this today with current kernel, you would mount with SMB3, version 3.1.1, you'd specify one extra mount option, POSIX. On the server, you might want to put mangled names no, right?
Yeah.
The directory and create mess, probably still helpful.
Yep.
And there's one additional parameter needed on the server.
SMB Unix extensions 2, or SMB2
The two
Unix
Unix
extensions equals yes.
So SMB2 space Unix space extensions equals yes.
So right now that's off by default. What I'm planning to do is when I've got this in the state where it's passing tests, etc., and upstreamable, is we'll probably put it into master. It may make 4.10, it may not. It will be off by default. And it will probably be, when we finally come out with Samba 5 is probably at the same time we turn off the SMB1 server by default, we'll turn the POSIX extensions on SMB2 on by default, would be my guess. So the other thing to realize about these is that they are supposed to provide a completely 100% POSIX compatible environment over SMB. So what do we actually mean by that? Well, the acid test, the thing that right now we're not testing, we're nowhere close to that, but what will convince at least me that we've gotten this right is if nobody boots diskless anymore, but if we were able to boot a diskless workstation with everything, including all the device directories, etc., remote mounted from an SMB3 server using POSIX extensions, I think we're done at that point.
That was feedback I got from some of the people in Microsoft. It caught their attention. They think it's really cool. But the way that, as a developer, what's my acid test? Can I build the kernel? Because that has case conflicts and things like that. And then secondarily, these XFS tests, the standard set of functional tests. But I thought it was really interesting, people who, let's boot from the network, boot from Samba, why not?
And the really great thing, of course, is you can't get to name streams.
Yeah.
This is beautiful, because that means that the virus writers and the people who are using, who just want nefarious features in the protocols can't get access to it.
So a couple of things to talk about.
Question, Steve?
Yes, go ahead.
Only support for the symlinks or also the hard links and the parse points?
Yes, so let's first talk about hard links. Hard links have been supported in the Linux side and in Samba for 5 years, 10 years. It's been a long time. So they've been supported forever. They use an existing Windows feature, hard links. We even get the link count right usually. So
the things that you're wanting, the hard links are already there. Symlinks, we had a long talk about this last year when we talked about it, about how to do symlinks without creating massive security holes. And I think we found a way to do that. That's what we were implementing. So symlinks will work. Currently, server-side POSIX symlinks will be reported as NFS-style reparse points, and when you create, this is an implementation detail, a Windows server may do it differently, or other servers may. If you really want to, you might want to store these as symlinks on the server. I think that's a bad idea security-wise, but you could do this. Symlinks are supported, as are block, character, FIFO, and Unix domain socket files. They're all supported in this version of the protocol. Reparse points are a Windows-only feature. So they actually already exist. They're in the Windows S side of the SMB3 protocol. They are not part of the POSIX extensions. So Windows reparse points, if they work on your server, they will work the same way they always did. There are no changes, there are no modifications to reparse points in the POSIX side of the protocol, except for one change, an optimization, which changes a must in the SMB2 Windows protocol into a may. And I do need to have a long conversation with Tom about whether that's possible or not, and how to do that. I have good reasons for requesting that change. It's something that I actually went back and forth about for many months, trying to think about the right way to do it. But I think making that change is the right thing to do. But we can go into that detail much later if you want to come and ask me.
So when we think about reparse points, one way to think about this is POSIX extensions don't have to include the new reparse points because they're already in Windows. They're already documented to some extent. Matter of fact, at SDC, 6 years ago, they were described in pretty good detail. So today, if you want to create a FIFO or a block device or whatever, you can go create a reparse point from now. That code is code that I'm doing. It's somewhat independent in a way of what you're doing, but it's not technically part of the POSIX extensions because it works to Windows. It works to
already in the Windows.
Yeah, it works to anybody that supports reparse points. It's already documented. So creating a FIFO. Now on symlinks, it gets complicated because there are 3 ways to create symlinks in Windows, or 2 common ways. And what we have been recommending is following the Mac model, the Mitchell-French symlinks, where rather than creating something on the server that looks like a reparse point or a symlink, we use this MF symlinks, which is a client-only followed thing. It's a file with special size and special features in it that allow the client to identify it as a symlink. The advantage of that is there's no security issues. The MF symlinks have zero possible things bad that can happen to the server on them. So you have an alternative now, because symlinks created by NFS into your product can be reported back a different way. We already support, and I should have showed you a picture of this, if you went into the Windows tool, and I think it's called MK-Link, and created a Windows symlink, you're an admin on Windows, you created a Windows symlink, the server would recognize, we already report those. But we default to the Minstrel French because they're safer when you're creating new ones.
So bear in mind the issue of safety on symlinks is actually an implementation issue.
On the server.
On the server side. Essentially, if the server follows symlinks, you're in a world of pain. If the server doesn't follow symlinks, then essentially you're in a... You can still mess it up, you can still have security holes, but you are much safer because the objects that the client is creating on your file system aren't followed by server processors. And so that's, we're making it easier for implementers to choose that mechanism rather than storing client-created symlinks as server-followed symlinks.
And technically, these are less part of the POSIX extensions because the 3 ways, 2 of which have long been finished in the Windows or the Linux client, and 1 that we were finishing in Volker's talk. Those 3 ways don't require technically the POSIX extensions. MF symlinks we use to max today, right? So these are, but you have some flexibility. Do you want client-only visible ones? Do you want the other type? And I think that this is reasonable. You get some choices on this. What is better for you may depend a lot on your server architecture. And we recognize all 3 types. So we'll report all 3 types. Now, the new mount option, what do you see different? If you do mount with POSIX, so here we have a mount with POSIX and a mount without POSIX, you can see the /mnt directory has POSIX under it, the other one does not. And we report in the debug information these flags. Now, I wanted to show some things that work. So this is, actually, these have been in for a while. Yeah. This is testing to an even older version, Jeremy's tree. So I created 4 files with different modes, 700 and 770, and viewing it locally on the Samba server. I wouldn't report back correctly over on my mount, because on my mount, I wasn't parsing intentionally his response output because it might change. But as you can see, the data was stored correctly on the server side with the right mode, and makedir the same way. So here we have on makedir, I'm passing -m with the different mode bits, and you can see it coming back. You have to deal a little bit, make sure you have the UMass set correctly if you're testing these things, but it was kind of fun because the mode bits are passed correctly. Actually, that's not as much of a customer pain point as this. I had a guy yesterday send me email. Some university guy he was having problems with some, actually it unlinked, not rename, but it was the same classic kind of thing. I open a file, I delete it, I open it again, the behavior is different on an SMB3 mount to Windows than it is locally on ext4. So here we have an example. I'm using tail to keep the file open, and take a look. You can see that the rename works as expected. The rename using Jeremy's server, current kernel code, so this is checked in on the client side and using Jeremy's tree, rename works as POSIX expects, as does unlink. Now statfs, we've improved this a little bit for the non-POSIX case, but in the there's things that come back on the stat call that let's see, the blocks available and inode count, right? You can see the inode, total inodes here. These things aren't available without the POSIX extension, so that's kind of fun, getting the stat response looking correctly, stat-f. And then with the POSIX extensions, you can see what it looks like here. So what are the details? It's tiny change protocols. So look how small. All we're doing for this POSIX extension, that's why, one reason why I guess I shouldn't be surprised that other vendors have prototyped this already. On negotiate protocol, we have a new context, 100. It's 8 bytes long. Basically, nothing in it. Just, do you support POSIX on the negotiate?
Yeah. So interestingly enough, the reason behind that is essentially to make sure that if you ask for POSIX semantics and the server doesn't give them to you, because it is a server choice whether it does so or not, you know, the only reason that create context actually exists is so that if you ask for POSIX semantics, the server doesn't grant them, you as a client know that the server was able to do so but chose not to. And why might that be important? So you can actually tell the difference between a server that simply doesn't support POSIX at all, like a current Windows server, or a server that does support POSIX but is choosing not to provide that to you as a client. Why might that be important is imagine at least on a Unix system where you have mounted a drive, you're mounting and exporting a FAT32 drive, for instance, or an exFAT or whatever, that simply doesn't provide the POSIX semantics, doesn't have mode bits or whatever. And so for that, if someone negotiates and accesses there, if someone is accessing your file system and they access a part of the file system that does support POSIX, you would grant it. If they access the part of the file system that doesn't support POSIX, you wouldn't grant it because you can't, because you're exporting a FAT32, exFAT drive or whatever. And now the client knows the difference, and the client can actually make intelligent decisions based on those responses.
So in the original POSIX extensions, we had properties on a share. So we could tell what was exposed. You know, we have tree connect context and that sort of thing in the future if we need to, but today this is very convenient. Look how small the response is. All the server had to do to claim support was one context. We sent the context on the request, they send it on the response. Very easy. So the trigger that tells us that we can try to use the POSIX context as needed on the opens comes back from that negotiate response.
I have a question. What the heck is the server leaking in the middle of that negotiated response? Not defined in RFC 4178, please ignore
Wait a
it.
second, you don't know that? Sorry.
I think that's something that Windows sends that's a GUI. It's basically it's part of the GSS.
Oh,
Yes.
Yeah.
GSS payload.
Don't look at this. It doesn't mean anything.
GSS payload.
Yes.
So,
Exactly what Windows does.
so SP-Nego is one of my least favorite topics ever, because when we get done this talk, one of the things on my to-do list is to go figure out a server that didn't return something for SP-Nego on this negotiate response and figure out how to, because one of the things the server can return is what mechanisms it supports, right?
Yeah.
And so our fun job is dealing with all the variety of servers, at least my fun job. And the Macs, I'm sure you sympathize. You know, you have servers that just don't tell you what mechanisms they support. So anyway, I love this kind of thing. It's a small change. Notice how tiny now on the create. Okay, so what do I have to send on the create? I got to send the mode if it's a create. If it's a create or a makedir, I got to send the mode. How hard is this? Not very. So I've got a tag.
It's the chainer one, the one above.
Yeah.
The next one down.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, you
And-
highlighted the wrong one.
Oh yeah, I'm sorry. We're off by one. You're right. That's the DH. It's yeah. Ignore that. Go down one. But yes. In any case, all that's happening is we got a GUID and we have a mode, and that's pretty much it that goes out. On the way back, it's a little more interesting. Now this has changed a little bit. So this is a couple months old, and it's a little bit. I'll show you a slide a little bit later, but as you can see, it's not that big what the server responds. It's about 6 fields the server responds with.
So the goal was no duplication of existing information. So if the Windows response produces a file size or an allocation size, then the POSIX pieces shouldn't duplicate that information. If the Windows piece provides all the timestamps, you don't. This is one of the errors that was made in the original SMB1 POSIX. It duplicated a lot of information that was already being provided by other mechanisms. So what we've tried to do in designing the SMB2 POSIX extensions is essentially add the minimum delta to the protocol to just provide the pieces that Windows didn't already provide.
So to give you a rough idea, what wouldn't work today if you're trying to Jeremy server? You can tell I'm not parsing the mode bits or the owner out of this. I'm sending them, but I'm not parsing them in the response because that code had changed actually in the last month or so. We're going to be finishing that up probably today and tomorrow, possibly Friday. but the parsing of the response, so I'm reporting the mode bits and owner. Also, nlinks, we get close, but I think that the nlink is going to be more accurate coming out of here. But that's basically it, owner, mode bits, nlinks. And there,
nlinks is already in the protocol.
it's already in the protocol, but it's listed in your code that you're populating it. Okay.
Yeah, but I already did.
Okay. So let's go back. So that may not actually be an issue. It may simply be the owner and the mode are the only things you'll notice differently. So when you do a stat on a file or an ls-la, you'll see those two fields correctly in 3 days where you don't see them correctly today. So what works without the extensions? Without the extensions, we can do, creating a file with a question mark in it, creating a file with an asterisk in it, the forbidden characters, all that remapping works. We can sometimes do rename and delete of open files by doing the silly rename kind of effects. We can do...
So you have to explain what silly rename is.
Silly rename is where you can't delete a file because it's open, but you rename it to something else, so it looks like it's deleted, and then finally when it's closed, it'll go away.
Yeah, essentially, if
It's an NFS trick.
People are familiar with NFS. If you ever administered an NFS server and you found these .nfs blah files left as droppings around, that was basically silly rename going wrong, where you tried to delete something, it renames the file to something silly, and then eventually deletes it.
Yeah.
Now, here is the interesting parts that aren't written down and documented yet, and this is actually quite important, especially for implementers, and that is, what are the interactions between POSIX creates and Windows creates? And essentially, in order to keep Windows semantics pristine, Windows semantics still trump POSIX. So if you have a handle open with no POSIX create context, and then you open with a POSIX create context and you try and unlink it, you set the delete on close and delete, it will obey Windows semantics. So in other words, it will not go away. It will stay around because there is still a Windows handle on the file. You would only get POSIX semantics for things like locking, for things like unlink, for things like rename, if there are only POSIX handles that are open on the file. So whenever Windows is opening and you've got Windows semantics, then those trump the POSIX extensions. So you only get the POSIX behaviors if all your clients are POSIX.
Yeah, generally, for any security mechanism, the more secure thing, the stricter wins. Obviously, there's a server implementation detail. You could imagine a server that does something different, but in general, we recommend that stricter wins so you don't get the unexpected behavior in Windows and have the data corruption. On the other hand, this only is an issue if you're opening in a conflicting way between Windows and Linux, which we're hoping is a minority of the cases, but it's already something that every single NAS vendor deals with.
So right now, what I'm planning to do is, once the server code is feature complete, seems to be working, is to go in and add a boatload of SMB torture test cases inside Samba that you can then run remotely against a server and actually validate that the behaviors are what you expect when you open a Windows handle, then open a POSIX handle, etc. Now, we won't be able to get everything because the combination is just essentially infinite, especially the number of flags. But we should be able to get the common cases. And so if a server implementer wants to use that, that's open source code. You can download it from Samba. It'll be part of the tree. It'll be part of the tree before it goes into master, and then eventually it will go into master once the tests all pass continuous integration.
So one of the cool things about the Linux client is that you can mount the same server as if you're a different client, no share sock. You can also mount with different options. So depending on the options you pick, we'll end up with a different session. We may or may not share the session depending on what options. So if you're really bored and you want to test things, mount normally, mount with POSIX, same server, same client. It looks like two different guys, and you'll be able to, sort of look at that behavior, that painful behavior. But just to sort of reinforce what works, without the extensions, we can do the name mapping. Without the extensions, we can very soon do the creating FIFOs and symlinks and that sort of thing. Many of the rename and unlink cases are close enough to the behavior you need. Advisory locking is mapped to mandatory locking, which often works the way you expect, but not always.
And often doesn't.
Yeah. With extensions, though, you get that. With extensions, you also get the mode bits passed as expected rather than emulated. And with the extensions, you also get the owner reported back in a saner way. We made a tough decision, which I think was, in retrospect, really good, that the owner sent back is not a Unix UID. And the reasoning for that I thought was really good. I don't know if you want to go through it or you want me to. So one of the things that we discovered that's fascinating in the NFS world is that UIDs on every system can be different. You know, UID 1 might be Jeremy on one system and might be Tom on another. UID 3 might be Chris on one system and it could be Ronnie on another. So having these UIDs that are basically have an implicit domain that's not sent on the wire is pretty useless. The beauty of SIDs, in many cases, they have the domain, the scope, so we know how to map them perfectly on the client. We may need user space tools sometimes, we may need a little config option, but we can always map a SID right, where we rarely can map a UID right in a distributed network. So passing a SID allows us to get the right UID displayed to the user.
And also, a cynic would say this is the server implementer punting the hard part to the client.
Yeah.
Which it is, yes.
Yep.
Question.
Even before, with the help of POSIX extensions, you still can get SIS by using get security.
Yes.
Why include or to save the
Yeah, to save the round trip.
So you return. So the reason, the question was, you can get that by doing query security descriptor. Why are you duplicating that? Well, the reason for that is on the open, which is most commonly being done by LS or whatever on POSIX. The next thing they're going to do is essentially a stat, and the query. There are no info levels that return the security descriptor in Windows. So as we're returning a lot of extra information anyway, we made the decision to return the owner and group, primary group SIDs as part of the create context reply in order to save a round trip. Because we're defining something different anyway, so we might as well include extra information which we know that the client is going to eventually have to fetch rather than querying. And the nice thing is, if the client then queries the security descriptor, you know, we guarantee that you will get the same information back. Now, this was the reason for not using, as the SMB1 POSIX extensions did, never returning the server visible UID and GID. So if you're running on a POSIX server, of course, you're having to map SIDs anyway. You have a UID and GID. I really wanted to make sure that those were never seen by a POSIX client. Because if you do, and your mapping is different, then you've opened a can of worms that is impossible to fix. Ronnie, yes, thank you.
You are not really saving a round trip. Compounding. Just do the query at the open and say.
Yes, so the comment was, I've implemented compounding, I am great. Which, yes, Ronnie, I know. But for people who don't have compounding in their clients, this saves them a round trip.
Yeah, and let's be fair. In Jeremy's code, I can sort of sympathize, looking at some of this code, that there are places where if you're not joined to a domain, the SID you're going to return is S-1-5, whatever. It's going to be manufactured with the UID possibly. So in many cases, he doesn't actually have to go to those X adders to return the mode. So it's more expensive to return the whole ACL than it would be just to return, you know, those two manufactured SIDs. Now, admittedly, I'd much prefer he's in Active Directory or something where you have, but it is kind of cool that that works. I think we ought to be also aware that we have alternatives here to return the UID. We could have done it the way Apple did, for example. And I don't want to completely preclude use cases where on the Linux client we find ways where there may be a place or two where the Apple extensions are good enough for some use case. And there's been good work done on the Samba side, just as an alert. There have been some very good work on the Apple emulation with the VFS Fruit module. But the focus has largely been on doing this because it's a better map to Linux and it's a better map to POSIX to do it with this context rather than the Apple context, which solves about half the problems we needed, or maybe a third the problems we needed. If you wanted to see an example of a Wireshark trace, here's one of the Apple extension AAPL. And like I said, it solves about a third of the problems. You can see the response here. We didn't completely discard the idea, but I think that in practice, it's better to solve the whole problem.
The only piece that is currently, well, there are two things that are or three things that are missing, and it might be nice. I'm comfortable with not doing these in the initial version of the spec. If people really find it a problem, then we might end up with a version 2 of the spec that does these. One of those things is currently to remotely access extended attributes. We haven't added any extended attribute requests. We just use the Windows on the wire EA format. The issue with that for POSIX is that those EAs are case insensitive. Now, theoretically on Linux, I don't know about FreeBSD, maybe on FreeBSD 2, you can create extended attributes that mismatch. You can, like makefile and makefile, you could create extended attributes with different case names, but the same name. The other thing is there's no ability to get to any other namespaces. Linux has user, security, and system EA namespaces. Right now, all of the EA calls map into the user namespace.
With the CIFS POSIX extensions, what we had done was we basically prefixed user in front of the X adders you know and love in Windows.
Did we?
I'm pretty sure we did.
I don't think we did.
I think we did.
I'd have to check the code.
Okay.
I don't think we did that. He thinks we did.
In any
I don't
case-
think we allowed that. I think because I only ever gotten stored user.
Yeah. His point is extremely important, though, and worth discussing more, because there is an enormous focus on using SE Linux, which depends
Yeah.
on this, in many, many key customer installations. Now, do we believe that's important? Even if you didn't agree and I didn't agree, NFS thought it was important enough to add into NFS 4.2 as one of the few pieces that was included in that, the support for this alternate namespace of names for SE Linux support, the mandatory security stuff. I think there may be emulation we could do, but it is one thing that makes me nervous about the extensions is the case sensitivity for the security-related features that Red Hat and others turn on.
The other issue is that SE Linux depends on the ability to get and set extended attributes on symlinks, not just on files and directories. Now, that we can still do that. That's doable given our current POSIX extensions design. You would literally open the file as or directory as a reparse point, set the A on that. I'm not sure that that's allowed currently on Windows. I think anything once you've turned something into a
we can do this on MF symlinks.
Once you've turned something into a reparse point, it doesn't allow you to do anything.
The MF symlinks. So because we have the luxury of symlinks the server doesn't know about, the Apple style MF symlinks, we also have the luxury for those kind of workloads where you need X adders on symlinks. We have the luxury of using the Apple style MF symlinks, the mutual French ones, to because they're just files to you, and so putting an X adder isn't going to bother you on that.
Yes. Yeah.
The server will never follow those, but at the same time, it may be good enough for some of the workloads as an alternative.
The other piece that we are not planning to support in version 1 is the draft POSIX ACLs, which actually Samba internally uses to map Windows ACLs into, because that's all we have on Linux. And my reasoning for that is that even in the Unix world, ACLs are moving to NFS v4 ACLs. And it is
and
Windows
4.1 ACLs.
4.1 ACLs. And Windows ACLs aren't exactly the same, but they are close enough that you can do a very good mapping between the two. So rather than trying to expose a different ACL format on the wire, which is what we did in the POSIX SMB1 extensions, I just decided to say, okay, Windows ACLs are it. The server has to decide what it's going to convert those to on the implementer decides what to map down to the server side. Now, Samba will map it into POSIX ACLs. When you get them, it'll take a POSIX ACL, map it back into a Windows ACL, but the client will never see a POSIX ACL on the wire. And I'm actually comfortable with that for many of the reasons that we've already gone through.
You lose something in translation.
You could lose something in translation.
Yeah, deny aces don't exist. So there's a religious argument about deny aces are evil.
Yeah, and to be honest, We could have done that. It would have complicated things massively, and I'd rather just flip you a nickel and, in the words of Dilbert's boss, say, "Hey, kid, buy yourself a better server, one that does ACLs properly."
Yeah,
and right now that precludes Linux, because Linux is still essentially dragging its heels on putting NFS v4 ACLs onto file systems.
Yeah.
I can't
by the
fight
way,
the kernel community and win. So.
Yeah, advertisement here. I did put a proposal out if anybody wants to be at the Plumbers Conference, and this was one of the topics for the little file system mini conference I proposed. So if people are interested in going to the Plumbers Conference and having a better argument with Linux maintainers.
And being shouted at.
Yeah, being shouted out for the idea of, NFS4, because the rich ACL discussion, some people on my team had proposed in 2008. It is 10 years.
It's at least 10 years.
Yeah, so it's kind of nice, the 10-year anniversary of the discussion. And multiple years we've been in the File System Summit, and it's like, okay, we're doing it now. Well,
so, I mean,
there's religious reasons why NFS 4.1 ACLs are not liked. But the reason, I don't want to tell Jeremy this, but the reason that I'm not worried about it is, I'm perfectly happy if they want to do a get whatever and view the Linux equivalent of the ACL, and it helps your app. Okay, we'll give you a mount option that'll let you view the POSIX view of the NFS ACL or the rich ACL.
And I have to get out of jail free for free software saying, well, just use FreeNAS on FreeBSD.
Yeah,
because they store real ACLs.
Yeah, and to be fair, you can store ACLs all kinds of different ways.
Yeah.
And the difficulty is how you make these work in a real customer app. If we turn behavior off or on differently by default, we have choices. We have ways of choosing. This has been done 1,000 different ways, and we can refer back to a wonderful talk by, Alexander Worth on some of the fun from like 6 or 7 years ago about some of these topics. But every NAS vendor has had to deal with it. And I don't think that's a real showstopper, because on the client we can return those if needed, and we could even allow you to emulate them on set, and it's been done multiple ways. But I do want to remind you guys that don't use CIFS. There's a reason this has been super important. The
Friends
priority for
don't
this.
let friends enable SMB1.
Yes. So a couple quick things to remember. It is great to do cool things like compiling the kernel, booting Linux like we talked about, right? We want to show blazing performance with a diskless system and swap over SMB and all these they're really small
as
things.
As fast as you get with a diskless system, which isn't very, but...
Well, I don't know. Have you seen RDMA? I mean, long lead stuff is really cool. I like 40 gig per second over the network. These Optane, and the fun thing is somebody else's money, that server.
That's always fun.
So for all key features, our goal here is that SMB3 is at least as good as what we had with the CIFS Unix extensions. And that was one of my little nervous points about the making sure we don't have the little corner case where we're possibly worse, we're not doing something CIFS did.
So our goal is essentially, or at least my goal is, for any use case, once we've got the Unix extensions, for any use case where people are using NFS, take a look at it again and say, well, maybe could I use SMB3 there instead?
Yeah, and we have to be careful because it's a moving target here. Yeah. The API is moving, but go ahead.
I just mentioned that earlier. The use case for NFS is there is actually space for the notion of server trusts client for UIDs. It's the HPC board.
Oh, you mean insecure? Okay. Yes, I'm happy to give NFS the insecure market.
Yes, of course, but there are reasons for doing that in certain situations. And I've come across people which depend on this for current application.
Okay.
We need that.
Well, guest mounts work. I mean, you want to do a guest mount.
And then we have another question.
Yeah, I just had a question regarding this. So on the Apple side, it's a hard choice. CIFS clients can do server-side critical symlinks, and SMB3 can't. So that's what our experience is.
So the question is, for the
what you just said,
so do you
not go backwards at all.
So you want clients to be able to create server-followed symlinks. Is that correct?
No, not server-follow, just server-side created.
Oh, sorry. Yes, that was the thing. That was the thing that we've actually been working on.
Yeah.
I'm not. Well, that depends on whether Mac. We will right now for POSIX extensions. They will be reported as NFS-style symlinks to the client. If you wanted to report them as Windows-style symlinks, again, that's a server implementer's option. Samba doesn't currently do that, but it could.
Yeah.
Especially now the code is, if you look at my tree, you'll see there's a boatload of extra functions to do the marshalling and unmarshalling of reparse points. So what you could do in Ralph's fruit module, which is our Apple specific one, you could add something that essentially says report server-side symlinks to the Mac client as Windows reparse points. That would be quite easy to do.
Or report them as MF symlinks if you wanted. You could do that even.
Yeah.
Yeah. So stepping back 10,000 feet on what Linux sees, if I create a symlink from the client, it's going to be created when we have that mount option, which is the default MF symlinks. It's going to be created Apple style, Initial French style. The server won't see it as a symlink. It'll look like a file on the server. There's no security issues. Very safe. If you mount to future Samba server or an appliance or Windows, and you've done MK-Link, right, the Windows symlink creation tool, you've gone into FSUtil or you've gone into one of the Windows internals tools to create a symlink, we see it, we report it, but we won't create it on the way out. We could fix that, and that's an easy enough thing to do. If we want to choose the preferred way of creating it, client, Mac style, or server style, we could make a mount option for that with, that'd be trivial. We already support viewing them, so you'll see the symlinks properly. What's new with the POSIX extension, and actually not really the POSIX extension, what's new here is our ability to follow the NFS style. And once again, we could have an option to pick which style of symlink on create we default to, but we'll recognize all three types.
So in order to create, right now for the goal is the idea for the POSIX extensions, you want to create a symlink that's a real object on the server. You create your zero length file, you set it as a reparse point, sending the NFS style reparse point data, close the file. At that point, you've got an object on the server that the client will see as a client followed style symlink. The server will just see it as a file with an extended attribute and will never follow it. So again, this is an implementation detail, or the server implementers can do it differently, but that's the way we're going to do it. So at that point, we never follow the symlink and the server is safe. The only reason that we report existing server-side symlinks back to the client as NFS-style symlinks is to cope with the case when people are migrating off SMB1. And so they have a tree that's set up that has a boatload of symlinks that are stitching things together. They move to the SMB3 POSIX extensions. They want to keep seeing those symlinks as symlinks. Now, if the symlinks are relative within the share, which is the only way they should work anyway, then the client will still follow them and everything will work. I do plan, at least in the Samba code, to provide a utility to allow you to convert a server-side symlink into the SMB3 POSIX reparse point. That'll just be a sort of a net convert link or whatever, and also a utility to convert them back if you want to turn.
Have you ever run that remotely?
No, that would be locally on the server. So you would basically write a script that would run down the tree and convert all the existing symlinks. Ronnie was the one who pointed out the necessity for that. You would be able to, if you're throwing away SMB1, you switch into SMB2, you would run that script once, you would migrate all your symlinks to client-followed ones that are files on the server, and then you're done. The clients would still keep working. Obviously, if you've got symlinks pointing outside of the share, you've got bigger problems, and you should fix those anyway.
SMB.conf thing, make that work anyway, right?
Yes, and I really... Well, it's that option. So the question was, you have a horrible Samba option that allows people to escape the share via symlinks. That option is still there and will remain for SMB1. It is completely ignored and never followed in SMB2. You are never able to get outside of the share with SMB2. And so eventually, when the SMB1 server gets turned to it's implementation specific.
Yeah,
when that server goes away, at that point, if you have symlinks that point outside the share, you are so hosed. You're going to have to fix that anyway.
Here we go. Right.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's an insecure option. If you want to run it that way by default, stick to SMB1. Then you've got other problems as well.
So a couple quick things. I skipped over some slides which you guys can look at, which talks a little about Jeremy's perspective. As you know, we'll notice some of the perspective about symlinks is altered slightly. What I wanted to emphasize is the smallness of this. Our goal was to make the POSIX extensions as small as possible. We leverage existing SMB3 features where possible, but here's the example. The open create contest, as you can see, it's quite small. So this is what his current code is populating in the response.
Okay, we do have that. Fair enough.
Yeah, so that was what we can remove it. It's fine, but that's what's populated. But what it does for me is it makes me have to exercise less of Ronnie's wonderful new code for all of this compounding, and it's a value. And also notice that the mode bits can be overloaded. So one of the things that we learned from the Microsoft NFS presentations are given a few years ago here, and also from the Mac and various other things, is that they have a special way of, they can report the owner buried within a SID, and then the group owner, and the mode bit, including the sticky and hidden and all those bits, accurately reported in S1588-3. So there's documentation on this already.
So doing a chmod becomes merely set security descriptor with a special set of aces.
So this is very nice because changing the mode becomes just changing one ace. So anyway, the special mode S1588-3. I take no credit for this. It's kind of odd looking to me, but I like using something that's already there.
Was it Apple or Microsoft who did it that way?
Both. So
It's documented on the Microsoft website.
yeah, it's documented on the Microsoft website, not authoritatively.
It's documented as a Windows thing.
Right.
That's the thing. It's not warranted as a protocol visible feature.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, we're going to write it down as one.
Yeah, there's a big difference.
Yeah, and we should consider the SID reserved though, because you don't want to overload. You wouldn't want to use S1588-3 for anything else, because it's weird. It has deny everything.
I'm sure it is, but okay.
Yeah, I know it's not.
Same thing about that 0x100 you threw in there. I mean, it's probably okay, but
Well, this is why my code isn't checked into the main tree, and
those dialogues need to happen just to be
yes,
sure.
yeah. Well, and my changing your must into a should.
Well, yeah, that's the other issue. We can
Yeah.
chat about that.
Yeah.
Yes, so that's why I'm not checking code in externally yet. And
Yeah.
he is, but he's crazy.
Yeah,
so.
but the only thing I checked in was the 100 pretty much. I didn't check this in, so don't worry. So, and one of the things I want to remember is that whether or not it's in a Microsoft document, we in the client, we have to deal with crazy servers. And it's not Macs that are bad. It's weird little appliances the size of your hand, or just weird stuff. So we already have to deal with strange behaviors. This was discussed at a Red Hat conference. It's been at SNIA conferences. It's got multiple servers that implement it. It's weird, maybe, but it's so common, not the crate context, but sorry, back one, this one. Whether or not we had anything to do with POSIX, we have to deal with this, because there are enough servers that implement this that we have to deal with. That has nothing to do with the extensions in some sense, but we have to live with dirty, evil behaviors of weird servers. But I want to emphasize that what we're documenting for part of the POSIX extensions are quite small. This is not bad. We're not talking about lots of info levels. We're not talking about huge extensions. And thank you, Aurelien, wherever he's hiding, because he has this Wireshark that you guys ought to update and help with, because it's so important to be able to view what we're doing sanely. Thank you for the Wireshark changes. And where do we go from here? We got to keep testing this. We've got to continue updating the wiki, which is a little bit out of date, and the authoritative document, obviously. So any questions and comments are welcome on Samba Technical Linux CIFS, and also downstairs during the Plug Fest.
So best case, it goes into 4.10, at least the Samba implementation side of it. Worst case, it doesn't go in until 4.11 or 5.0, whatever we call it, which will be a year out. So you're talking 6 months to a year before you see this probably in production code, depending on getting agreement with Microsoft on reserving some of the fields, etc.
Yeah, on the client stuff, it's marked experimental, so caveat emptor on the client. When you mount with POSIX,
Any questions? All right, well, thank you very much.